The Valkan Empire had ruled the outer reaches for 3,000 years. Their fleets patrolled 1,000 systems, and their authority remained unchallenged. No species had ever dared to question their dominance or oppose their military might. The Empire's warships moved through space like predators, and every civilization knew to bow before the crimson banners of the Valkan fleet. Admiral Kelrak stood on the bridge of the flagship Crimson Talon, when the alarm suddenly screamed across every console. Something massive had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of their patrol sector. The energy signature was unlike anything in the Empire's vast databases, and the readings made no sense to the experienced crew. Kelrax demanded a full report from his sensor officer, who stared at the screens with wide eyes. The officer reported an unknown vessel with a mass reading that exceeded their entire battle group combined. The tactical display showed something that should not exist according to everything the Valkan knew about ship construction. On the main view screen, a behemoth materialized from the distortion of space, and the bridge crew fell silent at the sight. The vessel was angular and brutal in its design, with armor plating that seemed to absorb light itself. Weapon ports dotted the hull like the eyes of some ancient predator, and the ship radiated power that made their own flagship seem like a child's toy. Along its side in stark white letters were words in an alien script that read, TCS Defiance. Kelrax ordered his communications officer to hail the vessel and demand immediate identification. The officer worked quickly and then reported something strange. The unknown ship was responding in over 600 languages simultaneously, as if they had cataloged every known species in the galaxy. A face appeared on the screen, and Kelrax studied the alien carefully. It was bipedal, with only 2 eyes and smooth skin with short dark hair. The creature wore a uniform of deep blue with golden insignias on the shoulders. The alien spoke in perfect Valkan without any translator delay. The alien identified himself as Captain Daniel Hayes of the Terran colonial ship Defiance, representing humanity and the Terran Federation. He stated they came in peace but were prepared for all possibilities. His tone was calm and almost casual, as if appearing before the most powerful empire in the galaxy was an everyday occurrence. Kelrax felt his blood chill, because these humans had appeared from nowhere, in a ship that dwarfed his entire fleet and spoke as equals to the greatest military power in known space. Kelrax forced authority into his voice and informed the human that he had entered Valkan space without authorization. He demanded that Hayes power down his weapons and prepare to be boarded or be destroyed. The threat had worked on 1,000 species before, and Kelrax expected immediate compliance or foolish resistance that would be quickly crushed. But Captain Hayes simply smiled, and it was not a warm expression. Hayes told the Admiral with all due respect that they had scanned the Valkan vessels and determined their weapons could not scratch the Defiance's paint. He stated they were here to open diplomatic relations and not to be threatened. Hayes suggested they start again with more courtesy in their tone. Behind Kelrax, his tactical officer whispered urgently that the human ship's weapons were charging. The energy readings made no sense, and the officer could not understand the numbers on his screen. A single one of their main cannons showed more destructive potential than the entire Valkan fleet combined. The officer's hands shook as he relayed the information, and other bridge crew members exchanged nervous glances. Kelrax had commanded warships for 40 years and had faced pirates and rebels and rival empires. He had never felt fear in battle, but now, as he stared at the human captain on the screen, something cold gripped his heart. Kelrax made a decision that would have been unthinkable moments before. He ordered his fleet to stand down and suggested they talk instead. Hayes nodded and agreed that talking was always preferable to fighting. The human provided coordinates for a meeting at a neutral location, and stated he looked forward to productive discussions. The screen went dark, and Kelrax stood in silence as his crew waited for orders. He knew this moment would change everything for the Empire, and possibly for the entire galaxy. Word of the human ship spread through Valkan space like wildfire. Every communication channel buzzed with reports and rumors about the mysterious vessel. Some called it impossible, while others claimed it was a trick or an illusion. But Admiral Kelrax's official report could not be dismissed or ignored. The Empire's military command went into emergency session, and Emperor Thrakos himself demanded immediate answers about these humans who had appeared so suddenly. Within 2 cycles, a proper diplomatic envoy arrived in the sector. Grand Marshal Vex commanded the Valkan Third Fleet and brought 50 warships with him. It was the largest show of force the Empire could muster on short notice, and meant to intimidate any potential rival. Vex was a veteran of 100 campaigns and had crushed rebellions across a dozen systems. He arrived expecting to face barbarians who would quickly learn to fear Valcon might. Captain Hayes agreed to meet aboard a neutral station called Meridian Hub, which was an old trading post on the edge of controlled space. Hayes arrived with only 6 people, including his first officer, Lieutenant Commander Lisa Morgan. He brought 2 security personnel and a diplomatic attaché named Greg Sullivan, along with 2 scientists. The small human delegation stood in stark contrast to Marshal Vex's entourage of 40, which included elite guards in powered armor, and 3 military advisors, and a dozen political officers. The meeting room fell silent when both parties entered from opposite sides, and the tension was thick enough to cut. Marshal Vex was an imposing figure who stood nearly 3 meters tall with crimson scales and ceremonial armor. He looked down at the humans with barely concealed disdain and began introducing himself with the full list of his titles and honors. He announced he was Grand Marshal Vex and voice of Emperor Thrakos, and master of Thousand Suns and conqueror of the Andalis cluster and breaker of the Eastern Rebellions. Before he could continue, Captain Hayes interrupted and said it was nice to meet him. Hayes introduced himself simply as Dan and gestured to his team with their first names only. The room fell into shocked silence because no one interrupted a Grand Marshal ever. Vex's eyes narrowed dangerously, and he asked if Hayes dared show such disrespect to his position. Hayes shrugged and explained that where he came from, respect was earned and not demanded through titles. He asked if they should discuss why they were here or if Vex preferred to list more of his emperor's accomplishments. Hayes added that they were on a tight schedule and preferred to get to the point. Lisa suppressed a smile while Greg looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Emperor Thrakos did not take the news well when Marshal Vex delivered the report in person. The throne room of the Imperial Palace echoed with his roars of anger as he paced back and forth. His advisors stood in silence while he raged about the audacity of these humans who appeared from nowhere and dared challenge 3,000 years of Valcon dominance. Thrakos demanded that his admirals assemble the Grand Armada, which was the ultimate expression of the Empire's military might. 300 warships would gather and crush these newcomers and broadcast their destruction across the galaxy. The Emperor stood before his war council and declared that the humans were a single species with a handful of ships. The Grand Armada would sweep them aside, and all civilizations would remember what happened to those who challenged the Valcon Empire. Admiral Kelrax tried to speak up and urge caution based on what he had witnessed. He started to explain that human technology was far beyond anything in the Empire's databases. But Thrakos cut him off and accused him of growing soft from his encounter with the human ship. Perhaps witnessing the destruction of the Defiance would restore his courage, the Emperor suggested. The Grand Armada assembled in the Kalos system, which was a strategic location near several major trade routes. Marshal Vex commanded from the massive battleship Eternal Dominion, which was a vessel 5 kilometers long and bristling with weapons. Every ship in the fleet was positioned according to traditional Valcon battle doctrine, with heavy battleships at the center, and cruisers and destroyers screening the flanks. The formation had won 100 victories over the centuries, and Vex had no reason to doubt its effectiveness. Now, the humans were sent a formal message inviting them to withdraw from the sector and avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Captain Hayes replied within minutes and declined the invitation. He moved the Defiance into position alone, and the sight sent murmurs through the Valcon fleet. The other human dreadnoughts remained at their stations throughout the sector and transmitted no movement orders. The message was clear because humanity believed one ship was enough to face the Empire's greatest fleet. Vex ordered his science officer to scan the Defiance again and find any weakness in its design or defenses. The officer worked frantically and ran every scan protocol in the database. He finally looked up with confusion and frustration on his face. The human ship's shields were operating on principles that Valcon science did not understand. The hull was composed of materials not in any Imperial database, and the reactor was generating more power than a small star, which should have been impossible according to known physics. Marshal Vex opened a communication channel to the Defiance and gave Hayes one last chance. He told the human captain to withdraw immediately or be annihilated along with his ship. The channel activated and showed Hayes sitting calmly in his command chair. Behind him, the bridge crew worked at their stations with no signs of stress or fear. Hayes looked almost bored as he responded to Vex's threat. He told the Marshal he was going to give him some free advice and suggested he scan the asteroid belt behind the Valcon formation. Confused by the strange suggestion, Vex ordered an immediate scan of the belt. The sensor readings that came back made his blood run cold, and he gripped the armrests of his chair. The asteroids were moving in ways that natural objects should not. No, they were not moving on their own because they were not asteroids at all. Dozens of human vessels had been hiding in the belt using stealth technology that made them invisible to Valcon sensors. The ships suddenly powered up and revealed themselves as cruisers and destroyers and carrier groups. The Valcon fleet was surrounded. Hayes continued speaking, and his tone remained casual despite the situation. He explained that humanity had not come to this sector unprepared or reckless. They had studied the Valcon Empire for months before making first contact. They knew Valcon tactics and strategies and response times. Humanity had been 3 steps ahead during this entire encounter, and the Grand Armada had walked into a trap. Vex felt rage and humiliation wash over him, but also a cold calculation of odds. The Marshal declared it did not matter because the Valcon still outnumbered the human forces. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice because the numbers were not as favorable as they appeared. Hayes asked if Vex was sure about being outnumbered, and his smile was not pleasant. He suggested that the Marshal fire one shot and find out just how outmatched he really was. Or Vex could do the smart thing and stand down and return to his Emperor with a message. The age of Valcon dominance was over, and continuing to fight would only result in unnecessary death. Vex's hand moved toward the weapons control panel, but stopped before giving the order. His pride screamed at him to attack and destroy this arrogant human who dared speak to a Grand Marshal in such a manner. But his survival instinct and his tactical training screamed louder. Around the bridge, his officers watched and waited for the command that would decide their fate. The tactical officer spoke quietly and reported that human weapons were locked on every single ship in the Grand Armada simultaneously. The officer's voice shook as he explained that the targeting computers were tracking all 300 Valcon ships in real time. If the humans fired first, the Grand Armada would not get a single shot off because their vessels would be destroyed before they could react. The calculations showed that even with numerical superiority, the Valcon fleet had no advantage. The human ships had better weapons and better shields and better targeting systems. This was not a battle that could be won through courage or tactical brilliance. Vex closed his eyes and saw the future clearly in that moment. If he gave the order to attack, the Grand Armada would be destroyed within minutes. The Empire's greatest fleet would be reduced to debris and floating bodies. The psychological blow alone would shatter Valcon authority across dozens of sectors. Every species under Imperial control would see that the mighty Valcon could be defeated. Rebellions would spring up everywhere, and the Empire would spend decades trying to restore order. All because he was too proud to accept reality. He opened his eyes and made the hardest decision of his military career. Vex ordered all ships to power down weapons and prepare to withdraw from the system. The command channel filled with shocked questions and protests from other ship commanders. Some accused him of cowardice, while others demanded he reconsider. But Vex repeated the order with steel in his voice, and gradually the fleet began to comply. 300 warships that had come to deliver destruction instead turned and began moving away. On the Defiance, Lisa leaned toward Hayes and asked quietly if he thought Vex made the right choice. Hayes watched the Valcon ships withdrawing on the tactical display and nodded slowly. He said Vex had made the only choice that made sense and possibly saved the Empire from collapse. Now came the hard part of actually building something better than what existed before. Lisa asked what happened if the Emperor refused to accept what happened here today. Hayes replied that they would deal with that when it happened, but he suspected Thrakos was smarter than his pride suggested. The withdrawal of the Grand Armada sent shockwaves through the entire galaxy within days. Every species with communication technology heard about what happened in the Kalos system. The Valcon Empire's greatest fleet had assembled to crush the humans and then retreated without firing a shot. Some claimed it was a strategic withdrawal, while others said it was surrender, but everyone agreed that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power. Within a week, 7 species under Valcon control declared their independence. They announced they no longer recognized Imperial authority and requested protection from the Terran Federation. The Empire's tributary states began refusing to pay their required tribute. Slave markets throughout Valcon space shut down as human ships began what they called liberation operations. Species that had suffered under Imperial rule for generations suddenly found themselves with options and hope. Emperor Thrakos retreated to his private chambers and refused to see anyone for days. The Imperial court descended into chaos as different factions argued about how to respond to the humiliation. Some demanded immediate war regardless of the cost, while others suggested opening negotiations. The military faction wanted to conscript every available ship and launch a massive assault. The diplomatic faction pointed out that such an action would likely result in the complete destruction of the Empire's military capability. Arguments turned into shouting matches and twice fights broke out in the council chambers. Meanwhile, humanity moved quickly to fill the power vacuum left by the Valcon retreat. Captain Hayes was promoted to Admiral Hayes and given command of the entire Terran Federation presence in the sector. The Defiance became the flagship of what humanity officially designated as the Frontier Fleet. Construction began on permanent stations and outposts throughout the region. Human ships escorted former tributary species as they established their own governments and defense forces on the planet Arvos Prime, which had been a Valkan tributary for 2 centuries. Hayes met with representatives from 15 different species. The meeting took place in a converted warehouse that was far from the grandeur of imperial palaces. There were no golden thrones or elaborate ceremonies. Instead, species sat in whatever seating accommodated their physiology and spoke directly without layers of protocol. An insectoid delegate named Chirix clicked his mandibles nervously before speaking. Chirix stated that his people were grateful for humanity's intervention, but they had important questions. Every protector throughout history eventually became a conqueror, once they had sufficient power. What did humanity want from the species of this sector? And what would happen to those who refused human demands? Hayes nodded because he understood the concern was legitimate and based on thousands of years of experience. He appreciated the direct question and promised to give an equally direct answer. Hayes explained that humanity wanted trade partners instead of subjects. They wanted allies instead of servants. The Terran Federation was offering protection and technology sharing and mutual defense agreements. In return, they asked for open trade and scientific cooperation, and respect for human colonies being established in the region. A reptilian female named Sella hissed thoughtfully and asked what would happen if species chose to refuse these terms. Hayes's answer was simple because if they refused, then they refused. He stated clearly that humanity was not the Valcon Empire and would not force anyone into unwanted agreements. Every species was free to chart their own course and make their own decisions. But humanity was staying in this sector regardless of who joined them. They would prefer to have friends and allies but would respect the choices of those who wanted to remain independent. The delegates looked at each other with expressions of surprise because this was not how powerful civilizations typically operated. Greg Sullivan stood and activated a holographic display that showed a draft document. He explained they had created something called the Frontier Coalition, which was not a government in the traditional sense. Each member species would retain complete sovereignty over their own worlds and systems. The coalition was a mutual defense pact and trade alliance with no tribute required. There would be no forced military service and no vassalage to any higher power. Members would agree to basic standards regarding sapient rights and peaceful resolution of disputes. The concept was revolutionary because for 3,000 years, the Valcon model had been the only option. Every species either dominated others or was dominated by someone stronger. The idea of equals cooperating without hierarchy seemed almost impossible to species who had only known imperial rule. Chirix stated that his people needed time to discuss this proposal with their home government. Hayes told him to take all the time needed because the offer would stand indefinitely. As the meeting concluded and delegates began leaving, Lisa pulled Hayes aside to a quiet corner. She reported that intelligence had received concerning information from multiple sources. The Valkan Empire had gone unusually quiet after the withdrawal of the Grand Armada. They had pulled back forces from contested areas and ceased most communication with tributary states. It was not like the Empire to be so passive after such a public defeat. Hayes frowned and agreed that the silence was worrying. Either the Empire was planning something significant, or they were collapsing internally from the humiliation. Both possibilities required humanity to remain alert and ready. He ordered Lisa to increase patrols along the border with core Vulcan space and to position rapid response forces at strategic locations. If the Empire decided to lash out, humanity needed to be prepared to respond immediately. On the Vulcan homeworld, Emperor Thrakos finally emerged from his self-imposed isolation. He had spent weeks in meditation and consultation with the oldest advisors in the Empire. These were individuals who remembered times before Thrakos' reign and had served multiple emperors. They had seen the Empire at its height and weathered various crises. Now Thrakos stood before the imperial court to make an announcement that would shock everyone present. The emperor stated that the Empire had ruled through strength alone for 3 millennia. Military might had been the foundation of Vulcan power and the source of their dominance. But perhaps strength by itself was no longer sufficient in a changing galaxy. These humans had shown them something unexpected, which was power combined with principle. The Empire now faced a choice that would determine its survival. They could adapt to new realities, or they could cling to old ways and perish. The court erupted in shocked debate and angry accusations. Some accused Thrakos of weakness and suggested he had lost his nerve. Others demanded to know if he was proposing surrender to the humans. Thrakos raised his hand and the room gradually fell silent. He stated clearly that he was not proposing surrender or submission. What he suggested was evolution of the Empire's methods and philosophy. They would negotiate with the humans not as defeated enemies, but as powers seeking a new arrangement. An elder counselor stood slowly, and his scales were gray with advanced age. He had advised 3 emperors before Thrakos, and commanded respect throughout the court. He stated that what the emperor proposed was unprecedented in imperial history. Such changes would fundamentally alter the nature of everything the Vulcan had built over millennia. Thrakos agreed completely and said that was exactly what they needed to survive. The galaxy was changing faster than anyone had anticipated, and civilizations that refused to change would be left behind or destroyed. He explained that the Empire's traditional methods had worked for thousands of years, but circumstances had changed. A new power had arrived with capabilities that matched or exceeded Vulcan technology. More importantly, this new power operated on different principles that appealed to many species. If the Empire continued on its current path, it would face endless rebellions and loss of territory. Eventually, the military costs would become unsustainable, and the Empire would collapse from within. But if they adapted and reformed their methods, the Empire could survive, and even thrive. Thrakos proposed releasing species that genuinely wanted independence while maintaining control over core territories. They would abolish practices like slavery that invited moral condemnation. The Empire would transform from a purely military power into something that combined strength with legitimate governance. Some territories would be lost, but the Empire would become more stable and sustainable. The debate continued for hours with passionate arguments on all sides. The military faction insisted that showing any weakness would invite more challenges. The reform faction argued that the current path led to inevitable destruction. Thrakos listened to every argument and then made his final decision. He would send a diplomatic mission to the humans with authority to negotiate a new arrangement. The mission would be led by someone the humans already knew, which was Marshal Vex. Vex was summoned to the throne room and given his new orders. He would go to the humans and negotiate terms for what Thrakos called peaceful coexistence. The Marshal was authorized to make significant concessions if necessary to reach an agreement. Vex listened to his orders with a mixture of relief and concern. Relief because he had feared the Emperor would order a suicidal military campaign. Concern because negotiating from a position of weakness went against everything he had been trained to do. Thrakos told Vex that he was chosen specifically because he had faced the humans directly. He had seen their capabilities and understood the reality of the situation. Other commanders might let pride cloud their judgment, but Vex had already proven he could make difficult decisions. The Marshal accepted his new mission and began preparations immediately. He would need a new kind of delegation that included diplomats and economists instead of just military officers. The negotiations took place on a new station that humanity had constructed specifically for diplomatic purposes. Harmony Station was massive and designed to accommodate dozens of different species comfortably. The main conference hall featured adjustable gravity and atmosphere controls and translation systems that worked seamlessly across hundreds of languages. The station itself was a statement about human intentions because it was built for cooperation rather than domination. Admiral Hayes led the human delegation which included Lisa and Greg along with several specialists in law and economics and xenobiology. Emperor Thrakos himself attended, which was a gesture that signified how seriously the Empire was taking these discussions. Marshal Vex accompanied him along with a delegation of diplomats and advisors. Also present were delegates from the emerging Frontier Coalition, including Chirix and Sella, and representatives from a dozen species who had recently gained their independence. The first session began with considerable tension in the air. Thrakos and Hayes sat across from each other at the large conference table, and it felt like two ancient predators sizing each other up. The Emperor spoke first and established the Empire's position clearly. The Valkan Empire had not surrendered and had not been militarily defeated. They were present because they recognized the galaxy had changed and new approaches were necessary. Hayes agreed and stated that humanity had no interest in destroying the Empire or humiliating the Valkan people. Hayes explained that humanity's goal was to ensure every species had the right to determine their own future. That principle was not negotiable, but how it was implemented could be discussed. Thrakos replied that such ideals sounded noble, but were difficult to implement in practice. The galaxy was full of species that could not defend themselves and needed stronger powers to maintain order. Hayes countered that maintaining order was different from maintaining control, and the Empire had often confused the two concepts. Greg Sullivan stepped forward with a detailed proposal that had taken weeks to draft with input from multiple species. He explained they were suggesting a three-tier system for organizing the sector. First tier would be species who wanted to join the Frontier Coalition and operate under mutual defense and free trade. Second tier would be species who wished to remain independent and could do so with guaranteed protection from aggression. Third tier would be the Valkan Empire maintaining control over its core worlds and any systems where the population genuinely supported Valkan rule. Vex asked suspiciously if humanity would truly allow the Empire to continue existing. Lisa clarified that it would be a reformed empire operating under different principles. There would be no more slave markets or forced tribute or military occupation of unwilling populations. In exchange, the Empire would maintain sovereignty over traditional Valkan territories and gain access to coalition trade networks and technology exchanges. The Empire would become a legitimate government rather than a military occupation force. Thrakos leaned back in his seat and his advisors whispered urgently in his ear. He stated that what they proposed would require releasing dozens of systems and abandoning profitable enterprises and fundamentally restructuring the imperial economy. Hayes admitted this was true, but asked the Emperor to consider the alternative. Continued conflict with humanity would result in more lost territory and potential civil war, as subject species rebelled. The path being offered allowed the Empire to keep its core territories and gain economic benefits while avoiding a prolonged conflict it could not win. The negotiations continued for many days with heated arguments and several walkouts. There were moments when everything seemed ready to collapse into renewed hostility, but slowly and grudgingly an agreement began to take shape. Both sides made concessions and found compromise positions. The Valkan agreed to release 47 systems to independence and abolish slavery throughout all territories. Humanity agreed to recognize Valkan sovereignty over core systems and not interfere in internal imperial governance. The agreement that emerged was called the Harmony Accords, and it reshaped the political landscape of the entire sector. The Valkan Empire would remain intact in its traditional heartland, but would fundamentally reform how it governed. Free trade would be established between the Empire and coalition members. A joint peacekeeping force would patrol neutral zones and respond to disputes. Most revolutionary of all the accords established the Sector Council, where humans and Valkans and coalition species would meet as equals. The Sector Council would handle disputes and coordinate policy and ensure no single power could dominate the region again. Each member would have one vote regardless of their military strength or economic power. Decisions would require a two-thirds majority, which meant cooperation was mandatory. The system was imperfect, but it represented something genuinely new in this part of the galaxy. On the day the accords were formally signed, representatives from over 30 species gathered in the Grand Hall of Harmony Station. Emperor Thrakos signed for the Valkan Empire with Marshal Vex as witness. Admiral Hayes signed for the Terran Federation with Lisa and Greg standing beside him. Chirix signed for the Frontier Coalition on behalf of the member species. The signing ceremony was broadcast across the sector and billions watched as history was made. Hayes stood on the observation deck of the Defiance afterward and watched the assembled fleet through the transparent hull. Human ships and Vulcan vessels and ships from dozens of coalition species floated together in formation. It was a sight that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. Lisa joined him with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. She commented that she never thought she would see such a day. Hayes admitted he had not been certain it would work out this way either. But here they were watching former enemies cooperate and building something new together. Lisa asked if he thought the peace would last, and Hayes gave an honest answer. He had no idea if it would endure, but it was a solid start. Change did not happen overnight, and there would certainly be violations and disputes and maybe even small conflicts. But they had established a framework and a set of principles which was more than this sector had before. On the Vulcan homeworld, Thrakos addressed his people through every communication channel. Some would say the Empire had been diminished, he told the assembled crowds. Those critics were wrong because the Empire had been transformed instead. The humans had demonstrated that true strength lay not in subjugation, but in cooperation. The Vulcan remained proud of their heritage and their accomplishments. But they were no longer alone at the top of the galactic hierarchy, and that was acceptable. He explained that the Empire had survived for 3,000 years by adapting to changing circumstances. Sometimes that meant military conquest, and sometimes it meant strategic withdrawal. Now it meant reforming their methods and embracing new relationships with other species. The Vulcan people would endure as they always had, but they would do so as partners rather than overlords. Some citizens protested while others celebrated, but most simply accepted the new reality. Greg Sullivan worked late in his new office on Harmony Station, reviewing reports from across the sector. 3 more species had applied for coalition membership in just the past week. 2 former Vulcan tributary states had opted for complete independence, but maintained friendly relations with both the Empire and humanity. The joint peacekeeping force had successfully mediated its first border dispute without any violence. It was messy and complicated and far from perfect, but the system was working. Back on Earth, the Terran Federation Council reviewed Admiral Hayes' comprehensive reports with satisfaction. The frontier expedition had succeeded beyond their initial expectations. Humanity had announced its presence to this region of the galaxy, not through conquest but through demonstration of superior capability combined with principled action. More dreadnoughts were already under construction in orbital shipyards. Additional exploration fleets were preparing to launch toward other sectors. Humanity was expanding into the stars with a clear message. Every sapient species deserved freedom and dignity, and the right to choose their own path. Some would welcome human presence while others would resist. But wherever humanity went, they would uphold those principles regardless of opposition. The Vulcan Empire had been the first major test of that commitment, and humanity had passed. Admiral Hayes stood in his quarters aboard the Defiance late one evening and looked at the star charts displayed on his wall. Each point of light represented a system and potentially multiple inhabited worlds. So many civilizations existed out here, and most had never heard of humanity. That would change in the coming years as human ships pushed further into unknown space. Some encounters would be peaceful, while others would require the same kind of firm stance they had taken with the Vulcan. He thought about the responsibilities that came with the power humanity now wielded. The dreadnoughts were tools, but tools could be used for good or ill. It was up to people like him to ensure that human strength served human principles. That meant making hard choices and sometimes standing alone against opposition. But it also meant building bridges and finding ways to cooperate with species that had very different values and histories. Marshal Vex's claws flexed, and it was a sign of barely controlled rage that every Vulcan in the room recognized. His voice came out as a low growl when he stated that the human vessel would leave Vulcan space immediately. He declared that the Empire did not recognize their authority or their nation, or their right to be in this sector. Hayes sat down at the conference table without waiting for an invitation, and the casual gesture sent another ripple of shock through the Vulcan delegation. He told Vex that his demand was unfortunate, because humanity was not leaving this sector. Hayes explained that humanity had been exploring this region for 6 months now, and they had made contact with 17 different species. All of those species had told them about the Vulcan Empire and its methods of control. They had spoken about tribute demands and military occupations and slave markets that operated openly. Vex slammed his fist on the table and the reinforced surface cracked under the impact. He declared these were internal matters of the Empire, and not the concern of outsiders who had no standing in this region. Hayes leaned forward and his casual demeanor vanished as his expression hardened. He stated that these were no longer internal matters, and that humanity had decided to establish a permanent presence in this sector. The Terran Federation was offering protection to any species that wanted it, and opening trade relations and building a network of allies. Hayes told Vex that the Empire could either work with them or get out of their way. The Marshal stood up and his full height was meant to intimidate, but Hayes remained seated and unmoved. Vex shouted that Hayes spoke madness because one ship did not make an empire. He declared the humans were alone and outnumbered and outgunned by forces they could not comprehend. Hayes interrupted and asked if they were really alone and outnumbered. He told the ship's computer to show them something, and the room's holographic display activated without anyone from Vex's team authorizing it. The security breach alone was alarming, but what appeared on the display made every Valkan in the room freeze. The hologram showed not one but 20 massive human dreadnoughts dropping out of faster than light travel in various systems throughout the sector. Each vessel was similar in size and design to the Defiance, and each one was broadcasting the same message in hundreds of languages. Humanity had arrived and was establishing diplomatic relations with all species in the region. The display showed timestamps indicating these ships had been moving into position over the past week while Vex was assembling his delegation. Lisa spoke in a quiet voice that somehow carried more weight than Vex's shouting. She explained that they had not come with one ship, but with an entire fleet. Back home on Earth and in the colonies, humanity had hundreds more vessels under construction or already in service. Humanity had been building and expanding and preparing for this moment for decades. Greg finally spoke up, and his diplomatic training was evident in his careful word choice. He stated they were not here to conquer, but to bring balance to a region that had been dominated by one power for too long. It was time for a new era of cooperation instead of subjugation. Vex stared at the holographic display, and his tactical mind was already calculating impossible odds. 20 ships like the Defiance meant 20 vessels, each capable of destroying his 50-ship fleet. Even one had been enough to make Admiral Kelrak stand down, and now there were 20 spread across the sector. The strategic implications were devastating, because it meant the Empire could not concentrate its forces against any single target. Vex slowly sat back down, and his movements were careful and controlled. He stated that this was an act of war against the Empire, and that Emperor Thrakos would not tolerate such aggression. But his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier, and everyone in the room heard the change. Hayes shook his head and corrected him by saying this was not an act of war. This was a change in the balance of power, and Vex needed to get used to it. The Terran Federation had no interest in destroying the Empire, but would not allow it to continue operating as it had for the past 3,000 years. Hayes stood and walked to the holographic display and began highlighting specific systems. He pointed out where human ships had already made contact with local populations, and where they had documented evidence of slavery and forced labor and tribute collection. He showed recordings of species that had reached out to humanity for help and protection. The evidence was comprehensive and detailed, and clearly the result of months of careful intelligence gathering. Greg stepped forward with a data tablet and offered it to Vex. He explained that it contained a proposal for what humanity called the Frontier Coalition. It was not a demand or an ultimatum, but an offer for a new kind of relationship between species. The coalition would operate on principles of mutual defense and free trade and voluntary membership. No species would be forced to join, but all would be welcome if they met basic standards of conduct regarding sapient rights. Vex took the tablet but did not look at it immediately. He asked what would happen to the Empire under this new arrangement. Hayes explained that species currently under Valkan control would be given a choice. They could remain with the Empire if they wished, or they could declare independence with human protection, or they could join the Frontier Coalition. The Empire would not be destroyed, but it would be required to respect the choices of the species within its borders. Slavery would end and forced tribute would stop, and military occupation of unwilling populations would not be tolerated. The Marshal finally looked down at the tablet and began scrolling through the proposal. His expression was unreadable, but his body language showed he was taking the document seriously. He asked how long humanity expected the Empire to consider this proposal. Hayes told him they had 1 month to provide an initial response. During that time, human ships would continue their operations, but would avoid direct confrontation with Valkon forces unless attacked first. Vex stood and his entourage immediately came to attention behind him. He stated he would deliver the proposal to Emperor Thrakos personally and provide humanity with an official response. But he warned that the Empire had endured for 3 millennia and would not simply roll over because newcomers arrived with big ships. Hayes nodded and said he expected nothing less from a civilization as old and proud as the Valkon. But he added that age and pride would not stop the changes that were coming. The meeting ended and both delegations left through their respective exits. Once outside the conference room, Lisa asked Hayes if he thought Vex would actually deliver the message accurately. Hayes said it did not matter because they had also sent copies of the proposal directly to Emperor Thrakos through back channels. Multiple species that maintained embassies in Valkon space had agreed to pass along the message. The Empire's leadership would receive the proposal whether Vex wanted them to or not. Greg looked worried and expressed concern that they might have pushed too hard too fast. Hayes disagreed and explained that humanity's advantage was their sudden appearance with overwhelming force. If they had been cautious or gradual, the Empire would have had time to adapt and resist. By presenting themselves as a fully formed power with clear demands, they forced the Valkon to react rather than plan. Lisa added that every day they waited, more species were reaching out to humanity for help, and the longer the Empire delayed, the more support the coalition gained. On the flagship Crimson Talon, Admiral Kelrax received Vex's full report of the meeting. He read it carefully and then read it again because he could hardly believe what it contained. 20 human dreadnoughts spread across the sector meant the Empire's military calculations were completely wrong. They had assumed 1 ship was an anomaly or perhaps a desperate gambit. But 20 ships indicated industrial capacity and planning and resources that rivaled or exceeded the Empire's own capabilities. Kelrax sent a priority message to the Imperial capital, recommending immediate diplomatic engagement.